Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention this morning, we're going to start the meeting. A lot of meetings going on today, so we're going to start this one. And to begin with, we'll ask Representative Nix if he would open us in prayer. You're number 12.
Number 12. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for a beautiful morning and for a night's rest. Lord, as we begin the day and as we begin our meetings, we pray that you would be with us. Bless us with wisdom, justice, and moderation in all our thoughts, that we might do the things that would be pleasing to you. In Christ's name, amen.
Thank you, Representative Nix. Ladies and gentlemen, I think y'all know in the audience, and we definitely know sitting up here, there's a lot going on. Yesterday was committee day, and I have to admit it was like a buzzsaw. So today is pretty much the same. I'd like to thank Madam Chair for giving me the opportunity here. She has to be back over in 341 because the budget has been going on since 7 a.m. this morning, and they have a full budget committee at 8:20. So a lateral pass, and I hope I don't fumble. That's the main thing. So what we're going to do this morning, we're going to open up in just a second with Representative Nix. We're going to actually hear a report from the subcommittee, and then we're going to hear from Representative Nix. Also today, we're going to have EPD come, Director Dunn, and give us a 30,000 foot view of EPD in general. I think it's always good for some of us to be refreshed, and some of us probably don't know all the ins and outs. So that will work well. The way we're going to handle that, he's going to give a brief overview. I know there'll be questions from people on the committee, probably questions from people in the audience also, and we appreciate those questions and we want you to get your answers, but we're going to politely ask if you would, once he finishes, if you would just contact Director Dunn, John, Deputy Director, and have those one-on-ones and get your answers that way, because I know a number of people here need to go to rules, and so that's the way we're going to handle this. So, okay, we will hear from the subcommittee. 27 subcommittee chair. Okay, Representative Campbell.
Thanks, sir. The Resource Management Subcommittee of Natural Resources and Environment met on February the 8th, 2022 to review HB 843. After hearing from the author and interested parties, the subcommittee offers the following recommendation. HB 893 do pass by committee substitute.
Yeah,
thank you.
Okay, thank you, Representative Campbell. So that's in the form of a motion coming from the subcommittee. Do I hear a second on that motion? Second. Okay, all in favor? Any discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, same sign. Thank you very much. Now we're going to full committee, and we will take up HB 983 as passed by the subcommittee, a substitute as passed by the subcommittee. Representative Nix.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ladies and gentlemen, I bring you the House Bill 893, and we're looking at LC 510104S. We've talked a good bit about the bill. And we found out a lot of things we didn't know as we went into the subcommittee. But this is very simple. All we're doing with this bill is changing the date on line 11. The fees related to the Hazardous Waste Trust Fund were set to expire on July the 1st of this year. And this bill would extend those for 5 years to 2027. And real quickly, there was a lot of discussion. We passed this real quickly out of subcommittee, and we found out there were some things we didn't know about it. These fees are not dedicated fees as we had on some others. They were actually not overlooked. It was intentional that it was not put into the dedicated fees. You mentioned that EPD is going to make a presentation. Every time I deal with something like this, I get a greater appreciation for what they do and the intricacies for the details related to it. But there will be a bill, I think, that will be introduced to look at dedicating these fees, but that is something that is totally outside of what we're trying to do. All we want to do is make sure that this does not go away on July the 1st. It's quite important. It's not a lot of money on a relative basis, but it's between $1 and $2 million annually, which are those funds are critical for the operation of the department to keep us safe from the hazardous waste out there. So with that said, I hope you will consider this and pass it with just a very simple change there to make that 5 years before that has to be redone.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Representative Nixon. As you stated, that kind of relates back to House Bill 511. And so if that bill, I can't say for sure because, you know, bills are signed by the Speaker of the House, and that bill would probably go to Ways and Means. So that's just a thought.
That's my understanding.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Any questions? We got a question from microphone 29.
Proper time, I'd like to make a motion.
Okay, at proper time. Any questions, members of the committee? Representative Corbett,
Make a motion to pass.
got a motion and a second. Any further discussion? All those in favor will say aye. All those
Aye.
Fine, fine. We got some. Who do we have online?
This is Representative Viola Davis.
Okay, thank you.
And
Representative Davis.
Representative Mary Frances Williams.
Oh, thank you, Representative Mayor Francis. Call it. Okay, so do pass. Thank you, Representative Nix. You fill out your paperwork and you're on a roll to the Rules Committee. Madam Chair, hope you have a success passing the budget. All right, at this time, we would like Director Dunn, if you have the floor, and we appreciate you being with us today, you and Deputy Commissioner, and we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. Here, David sent me a note yesterday asking if I would present to the committee, and I thought it was a great idea, particularly during the consideration of 893. I thought there was a lot of stuff about the agency that maybe wasn't well known. So I thought I would take this opportunity today just to give some background on how the agency is organized, how it's staffed, and how it is financed. And of course, hopefully we'll have some time for questions at the end. I've got a PowerPoint. David has the PowerPoint, and it's up here on the screen. Who we are. So EPD is the state agency charged for protecting Georgia's air, land, and water resources through the authority of various state and federal environmental statutes. We implement and administer about 24 state environmental laws passed by this body. Georgia Air Quality Act, Georgia Groundwater Use Act, Georgia Surface Mining Act, Georgia Erosion and Sedimentation Act, et cetera, et cetera. So there's about 24 state environmental laws that we administer and implement. We also have full permitting and enforcement authority for all of the major federal environmental laws, including the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Safe Drinking Water Act, and RCRA, which deals with hazardous and solid waste management. EPD's goal is to regulate the utilization of our air, water, and land resources to protect health and to promote economic growth, recreation, and ecology. Most of our assigned functions are regulatory. In other words, we establish and enforce rules and standards regarding water quality, water supply, drinking water safety, dam safety, air quality, solid waste, hazardous waste, surface mining, and underground storage tanks. We're generally not a planning agency. We're a regulatory agency. We do have some planning functions, particularly in water supply, to ensure we have adequate water supply to meet our needs. We do some planning as relate to floodplain management, but generally we're a regulatory agency. We're not a land use agency. We're not a zoning agency. We don't do those things. We're not a research agency. And we're generally not an educational agency, although we do some educational functions related to adopter stream and things like that. Our primary mission, the point I want to emphasize, is regulatory. We take the laws, we take the rules and the standards and apply those standards to behavior. We administer the Hazardous Waste Trust Fund and the Solid Waste Trust Fund. We do some licensing, surprisingly enough. We do licensing for professions such as well drillers, landfill operators, and industrial radiography. We maintain an emergency response team that's available or has the capacity to respond on a 24/7 basis to the release of hazardous or toxic materials. And finally, we operate a lab capable of analyzing air, water, and soil samples for a large number of constituents to ensure compliance with state and environmental regulations. Going to the next slide. And I know this is not the Appropriations Committee. I know today's passing the budget, but it's important to know a little bit about how we are financed. EPD's budget is relatively small, but it can be very complex. We have nearly 50 separate revenue sources. Only one of those sources is actually appropriated state funds. We're organized into 3 budgetary programs. Most of our funds are stored in the Environmental Protection Program, as you can see on the screen, but we do have 2 separate programs for the Hazardous Waste Trust Fund and the Solid Waste Trust Fund. I'll talk about these a little later. One thing I do want to emphasize is that the funding that's in the Hazardous Waste Trust Fund and the Solid Waste Trust Fund is very limited in terms of what it can be spent on. They're not fungible funds that I can use to identify where the needs are and put the funds there as appropriate. About 32% of our budget are state funds appropriated by this body. 24% are federal funds, primarily from EPA, but we do have some FEMA funds and occasionally some DOT funds as well. Our largest fund source are other funds. 44% of our funding is other funds. These are fees retained by the agencies. This includes the Georgia Underground Storage Tank fees, vehicle inspection fees, Title V air permit fees, and drinking water fees. Not reflected in this budget, which we kind of talked about with 893, are fees collected by the agency but remitted to Treasury. Those include scrap tire fees, solid waste fees, hazardous waste fees that are addressed in 893, and I'll talk about those in a little bit. In terms of our organization, we are staffed by approximately 700 full-time employees. Most of those employees, over 80%, are environmental specialists, engineers, geologists, lab scientists, or modelers. Very highly technically accomplished staff that we employ. We're organized into 3 branches, each relating to the media that we regulate: air, land, and water. And we also have a district office. Our air branch, primarily located at the trade port, which is an office we have down near the airport. The chief of our air branch is Karen Hayes, and her deputy is Jim Boylan. Land branch, located both in the towers and down at the trade port. That's led by Chuck Mueller, and the deputy is Sarah Visser, who's with us here today. The water branch, which is located in the towers and in the ag building. They also have offices relating to agricultural water use in Tifton and Dawson. The director there, the former director is Jack Kapp, who this committee may know. Jack retired on the last day of January. The new director is Anya Trzynski, and you'll have a chance to interact with her. She's terrific. And Anya was the previous assistant branch chief. She moved up to branch chief, and we're currently recruiting for that assistant branch chief. Our district offices, we have 7 district offices: Albany, Athens, Atlanta, Augusta, Brunswick, Cartersville, and Macon. These handle many complaint investigations, emergency response, inspections, and compliance activities. The head of the district offices is Mr. Jim Cooley. As I mentioned, we have a laboratory out in Peachtree Corners. And then finally, you can see the number of folks in administration. Administration includes HR, IT, legal, finance, et cetera. And I'm the director, Rick Dunn, and the deputy director is John Eunice, who's here with us this morning. Here's a chart of EPD's expenditures over the last 20 years. You can see that there was, of course, a peak prior to the recession. But in general, EPD's expenditures have been fairly flat over the last 20 years. 2021 expenditures match what we spent in 2002. I would make note that probably the best predictor of our workload is population and GDP. And over that same period that our budget's been flat, population's grown almost 30%. GDP in Georgia's grown almost 40%. But that's the breakdown of our spending by fund source. How we spend our money. Typically about half the money of the dollars we spend, we're talking about total funds here, are for personnel, personal services. These are folks who write permits. Like I said, we are a regulatory agency. These are folks who write permits, inspect facilities, and investigate complaints. That's typically about half of our expenditures is on people. The next big chunk of spending, 30%, is on contractual services. These are largely contractual services for vendors to clean up abandoned sites. They might be vendors to do some of our floodplain maps, et cetera, et cetera. So that's how we spend our funds. I mentioned before when I went over the budget, about 44% of our funding are fees that we collect and retain. These are called other funds, our retained revenue. And this chart lists our sources of retained revenue. Most of our fees that we collect and retain are concentrated in the air protection branch. It's interesting, the air protection branch is almost fully funded by fees that it collects. That's not true for the land branch, certainly not true for the water branch, but the air branch is almost fully self-funded, does not rely on many, if any, state funds. The largest fund source there are air permit fees. These are fees charged, allowed under the law for obtaining a permit. There's also fees assessed on certain emissions as well. It's interesting that part of those fees are based upon emissions. As our air gets cleaner, guess what happens to our revenue? It goes down, which is good, but it creates some interesting management challenges. The second thing you see, I hope you still see, there we go, are I&M fees. These are inspection and maintenance fees. This is related to the vehicle emissions program in Metro Atlanta. When an emissions inspector purchases a certificate from the state of Georgia, a portion of that certificate goes to the contractor who manages the I&M program, the vehicle inspection program. $1 of that fee goes to the county, and about $1.40 of that fee goes to EPD. So that is the I&M fees. And finally, I won't get into it, but there's some radioactive material fees as well. And the land branch, again, these are fees we collect and retain. You see Gus Financial Assurance, a big chunk of money, almost $27 million a year. People with underground storage tanks are required by law to have financial assurance. In case there's a release from that tank, they're required to have the money available that would clean up that release. The state of Georgia, under the Underground Storage Tank Act law, maintains its own voluntary financial assurance program that convenience stores and others can participate in. So this is a voluntary program. It's funded by a 3/4 of a penny charge on through output at a convenience store, for example. And the purpose of those funds is it's an insurance program to hold those back in case there's a release in the future. Those funds will be used to assist the responsible party in cleaning up that site. So that's a lot of money. That's about half of our other funds that we retain, but those funds are not operational. Does that make sense? Those funds are held back for future liability. Those are not funds we use. We use about 2 million of those funds to finance the program, but most of those funds are held back and are spent later for a release. And we do collect some fines and fees and some settlements related to the Hazardous Waste Trust Fund and the Solid Waste Trust Fund. Finally, in terms of retained funds, our lab charges fees to test drinking water. We collect a little over 4 million. I will note that the fees we charge at the lab are not enough to recoup our cost. We always face a dilemma in terms of what it costs to do the lab versus making it affordable for small systems to have the drinking water tested, which is very important. So our drinking water fees cover a little over 40% of our expenses at the lab. Does that make sense? These are funds that we collect and remit to Treasury. And this is kind of the discussion that came up on the hazardous waste fees. We collect solid waste fees. I'll talk about that in a second. That's related to the Hazardous Waste Trust Fund. These are the tipping fees. We collect scrap tire fees. You can see the numbers there. Under HB 511, those are collected and remitted to the Treasury, but under HB 511, they're required to be appropriated back out to EPD. So they come in as fees or other funds, remit to the Treasury. They are appropriated back out to the trust funds in the form of state funds. Does that make sense? There as well. We also collect a number of other fees that we remit to the Treasury. They're listed there. I won't go over each and every one, but you notice there's two, the hazardous waste management fee and the hazardous substance fee, the Title III fees. Those are the two fees we were talking about in 893 that we collect and remit to Treasury. And that's what the committee just reauthorized collection for another 5 years. Our biggest challenge currently is agency staffing and turnover. I mentioned before, most of our employees, over 80%, are engineers, geologists, environmental compliance specialists, modelers, and laboratory scientists. All of these positions require at least an undergraduate degree in a STEM field: science, technology, engineering, math. Many of our employees have master's degrees or PhDs as well. There is high demand for folks with STEM skills, folks coming out of college with STEM degrees, and we are competing for that talent. And it's quite a challenge to compete with that talent. Well, in our world, we're in competition with the private sector, with private industry. We're in competition with engineering consulting firms. We're in competition with the US EPA. Over the last 3 years, you can see the line. The bars are the number of employees. The line is the actual turnover rate. And you can see our historical turnover rate has been fairly low, below 10%, but it has jumped up in recent years. The last few years, it's been between 15 and 20%. This is not as high as the statewide turnover rate, but I will say it's unusual for us to have turnover this high. And as I mentioned before, we're a regulatory agency. Our decisions are highly technical. All of our decisions tend to be reviewed in the court system. They're often challenged, things like that. So for us, having consistency, following established procedures, having a lot of institutional knowledge is critical. And the fact that we have turnover rate this high, turnover rate of 15, 20% means every 5 or 6 years, our entire agency turns over. Having turnover rate that high is almost an existential challenge for us. Over the last 2 years, you can see how this adds up. Air protection, 30% turnover, land protection, 37% turnover. I'll go through that. I won't go through that as all of it, but you can see running an organization with that type of turnover, although it's lower than the statewide rate, is a big, big challenge for EPD. So far, the first 6 months of this fiscal year, EPD has experienced 81 separations, which would annualize into a 23.5% turnover rate. So our turnover rate is actually getting worse so far this year. Now, some of the turnover, sorry, this slide didn't turn out as well as I thought. Some of this turnover is due to retirement. Some of it, we have to release people for performance. That's some of the turnover, but most of this turnover, about 85%, are people leaving EPD for another position. And often those positions are higher paying. It's not uncommon for folks to leave employment with EPD and receive at a minimum a 20% raise, but often double their salary working in the private sector or with some other entity. Our biggest competition so far, or more recently, has been with Region 4 of the Environmental Protection Agency, which is right down the street. Region 4, the Environmental Protection Agency, I mean, they're giving our folks considerable raises. They can make 50% more than they're making now. Plus, the job is easier. You generally don't have to supervise people. It's got a lot of benefits besides pay that go with it. When people leave, it's hard for us to replace them because you see some of our starting salaries. Our starting salaries, bottom line, simply is not competitive with the folks we are competing for talent with. So I'll leave that there. I just want to bring, that's probably our biggest challenge currently right now, is the turnover we're facing. The good news is in the budget, in the governor's budget, there's a raise for employees that will help tremendously. It's a good start, but we have a long way to go to even approach competitiveness with some of our private sector and EPA as well. Oops. Let me just say a word about our trust funds. Again, I mentioned we have 2 trust funds. They don't make up a lot of our expenditures. Both trust funds combined represent about 10% of our expenditures, but they're separate programs in the budget, so they receive a lot of attention. This committee has dealt with these trust funds a lot. This is the Solid Waste Trust Fund. I'll say some words about what it does, but the first slide is just looking at the discrepancy between the amount we collect, which is the dark gray bar, and the amount that's been appropriated back out to the agency, which is the orange bar. The gray bar is the amount we collect from the solid waste tipping fees. With the tire replacement fees. I'll talk about that in a second. And then orange bar, again, is what's appropriated back out. Under HB 511, those two bars will be equal. So in the governor's proposal for FY23, starting July 1, matches what we collected in the scrap tire fee. Here's the source of funding, just explains what these fees are. The major source of funding for the Solid Waste Trust Fund is a $1 per tire fee imposed upon the retail sale of most new replacement tires sold in the state. That fee, again, was dedicated to the Solid Waste Trust Fund last year, and it is authorized through 2032. Again, we collect the fee, deposit it to Treasury, comes appropriated back out to us as state funds. There's other funding in the Solid Waste Trust Fund. The Solid Waste Trust Fund retains any penalties or fines assessed for violation of the Georgia Solid Waste Management Act. And also we collect interest on the balance of the fund. But generally, almost all of the expenditures in the Solid Waste Trust Fund come from the appropriation of the tire replacement fee. I mentioned before that funds appropriated to the Solid Waste Trust Fund are not really fungible. I mean, they're very limited. Of course, all our funds are limited to what you can spend it on, but the trust funds tend to be particularly limited. The authorized purposes are listed there on your screen. It's to manage scrap tires and the abatement of scrap tire piles. It's for corrective action, closure and post-closure care of abandoned landfills. It's for emergency actions for responsible parties who may not be willing to take action to correct a public health or safety issue as it relates to solid waste disposal. And also we use the funds to provide grants to cities, counties, authorities, and state agencies to encourage the reduction of solid waste disposal and to prevent and abate the illegal dumping of solid waste. In terms of how we spend the Solid Waste Trust Fund, the fund supports, well, historically, at least since the Great Recession, we focused on really two of those authorized purposes: the operation of the scrap tire regulatory program and the cleanup of abandoned scrap tires pile sites. Again, we focused on just those two because of the monies that were appropriated to us were somewhat limited. The fund supports about 24 employees at EPD. Most of those employees work in scrap tire permitting, scrap tire enforcement, remediation of scrap tire piles, and landfill monitoring activities. Typically, about 65% or 2/3 of our expenditure in the Solid Waste Trust Fund goes to these staff. Now, in terms of cleaning up scrap tire piles, whenever possible, our goal is to ensure that the responsible party cleans up the waste, not taxpayers. So most of the time we're able to utilize our enforcement authority to ensure responsible parties clean up scrap tire piles. Occasionally we have scrap tire piles where the responsible party cannot be forced to clean them up. And then we go to a contractor that goes out there and cleans up and appropriately recycles the scrap tire piles. Since 2017, we've been very successful in supporting local governments with what's called scrap tire amnesty events. We will finance local governments, having a Saturday or Sunday for folks to bring in scrap tires, and they will dispose them at no charge to the folks, and we would reimburse them for that cost. Again, the purpose there is to prevent those scrap tires from being deposited where they shouldn't be. And lastly, as I mentioned, the fund may be used for remediation, closure, and care of abandoned landfills. Since 2017, we've used the Solid Waste Trust Fund to properly close 2 abandoned landfills, one in Glenn County and one in Walker County. And beginning this year, we've started using funds from the Solid Waste Trust Fund to clean up an abandoned landfill in Sumter County. There's an authorized purpose in terms of general reduction of solid waste. Since 2011, we've been unable to do that because of funding, but with the infusion of funds this year as a result of HB 511, we should be able to do more of that activity. I'll just be very brief. This is just an example of our Solid Waste Trust Fund spend plan for 2022. You can see on the revenue side, we get state appropriations. We have some penalties in there, some interest in there. There's a large fund reserve balance. Those are funds. Most of those funds have been obligated. It just sometimes takes multiple fiscal years to expend it. So for example, you clean up a landfill, you don't do that in 12 months. You dedicate the funds to clean up that landfill and you pay out as certain objectives are achieved. So that fund reserve balance is not necessarily just sitting there. Most of that has been obligated. And then on the expense side, you can see the scrap tire regulatory program. That's our money for staff. Scrap tire abatement. That is the funding we use to clean up scrap tire piles when there's no responsible party. Our funding to local governments to encourage recycling of scrap tires. You can see the funds for abandoned landfill closure. We keep funds for emergency reserve. We've had instances where someone with a solid waste site, we've had a good examples recently. A solid waste site was on fire. We could not get the responsible party to put it out. So we threatened to use funds from solid waste trust fund to do that, but we were able to get the responsible party to work with us. You see a line there for Keep Georgia Beautiful. That was something added by the General Assembly asking us to fund the Keep Georgia Beautiful Foundation. And again, I'll be very brief here. I know we're running out of time, but the Hazardous Waste Trust Fund, kind of the same approach. Dark bar is collections. These are collections from the solid waste tipping fee and from the 2 hazardous waste fees, and the orange bar is what's been appropriated back out to the agency. We should know the source of funding now after looking at HB 93. The largest source of funding are those solid waste tipping fees. Every ton of waste that goes to a landfill in the state of Georgia is assessed a tipping fee. 75 cents of that tipping fee goes to, per ton tipping fee goes to Georgia EPD to fund the hazardous waste trust fund. And also are the hazardous waste management fees and the hazardous substance reporting fees, which HB 893 would extend. I'll skip that and for the thing. So here's the authorized purposes of the hazardous waste trust fund. Again, it's limited on what we can spend our money on. Monies appropriated to the hazardous waste trust fund may be used to investigate and clean up sites with releases where parties responsible for the contamination are unable or unwilling to do so. We use it to reimburse local governments for the investigation and cleanup of leaking municipal landfills. Again, for emergency actions associated with the release of hazardous substance and for administration of the act, which is basically staff. Here, most of the funding appropriated to the Hazardous Waste Trust Fund has been used to clean up sites on the hazardous site inventory where there's no responsible party. We have about 61 sites on the abandoned sites on the hazardous site inventory. These are sites where there's been a release of a hazardous substance. It's abandoned in the sense there's no responsible party. And we use funding to clean up about 15 of these sites, or to begin cleaning up about 15 of these sites each year. About a quarter of the funds we spend has been used for staff. Hazardous Waste Trust Fund supports about 39 EPD employees working primarily in the areas of hazardous site response and remediation. And again, I'll be brief, but you can see how we spend the money in the Hazardous Waste Trust Fund. The last thing I wanted to mention is just kind of give you, I like these types of things, kind of EPD by the numbers, kind of what we do. I won't go over each and every one, but gives you a sense of our scope of responsibility. Starting off with the land protection branch. You can see we deal with underground storage tanks in the land protection branch, scrap tires, hazardous waste, solid waste, surface mining, lead-based paint remediation, et cetera, et cetera. Air protection branch. What they do is regulate stationary and mobile sources of pollution, radioactive materials, monitoring air quality, et cetera, et cetera. And finally, the watershed protection branch, which manages water supply, water withdrawals, drinking water, public drinking water systems, stormwater, erosion and sedimentation, stream buffers, safe dams, et cetera, et cetera. Last thing I want to mention, Mr. Chairman, is kind of accomplishments. There's been a lot of accomplishments in the area of environmental policy over the last 50 years, primarily due to technology, primarily due to the behavior of business, primarily due to the attitude of citizens, but also due to the actions of EPD and the EPA. In terms of air quality, the criteria pollutants, those pollutants that are most widespread, most damaging to public health, Those are at the lowest levels, even as our economy and population has grown. You see less open dumps of solid waste. You see less scrap tire dumps. Hazardous waste sites have been identified and are cleaned up for reuse. Our major rivers are no longer repositories for sewage. Water quality for our rivers and streams are way up. More folks have access to clean drinking water, and we enjoy a water supply in Georgia that will meet our needs for the next 50 years. So very proud of the accomplishments we've done. That's the 30,000-foot view of EPD. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, Director, we really appreciate you. That's a lot of information.
It is.
And I also want to thank David Hartman too. While you were presenting, and we've got people online, he has sent this information to everybody's email. So you'll have it. You have the paper copy if you made notes, and you'll also have the email too. Again, appreciate you and Deputy being here. I know people have questions, and we're again going to restate, please just contact the director or the deputy director if you have those questions, and work one-on-one, because I know several people here are headed to rules. I'm one of those, and I've got a bill there. So we really appreciate it, and thank the committee for your attendance this morning. Any other comments by the committee?
Thank you.
If not, meeting stands adjourned. Thanks, Director.
Mhm.